In December of 2013, the New York Times published a 5-part series that its public editor called the largest investigation the Times has published all at once in its history. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Andrea Elliott spent 15 months with a young homeless girl named Dasani, who lived in a city shelter in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. The story revealed the harsh truths about the lives of New York's homeless families, living in squalor all across the city. The city's poorest people were suddenly impossible for the most powerful people to ignore. 2 of Mayor Bloomberg's deputy editors took to the Wall Street Journal to defend the mayor's legacy on fighting homelessness. And then, 12-year-old Dasani was asked to be on stage in the de Blasio inauguration. Faith Hester was Dasani's 6th grade teacher. She is a single mom and has taught a lot of kids like Dasani. She's here with Andrea Elliott and NPR's Michele Norris.
Hello again. We are really in for a special 20 minutes to go deep into the life of a child that those of us who read her story will never forget. As you just heard in the introduction, Andrea is responsible for bringing us that story, and I feel like I can't call you by your first name because I was raised never to call teachers by their first name. So Miss Hester was responsible for her education. And how many of you remember reading that story? It really is unforgettable. I still have it.
Thank you.
I kept, it was so beautifully illustrated also. I actually still have the hard copies of it.
That's Ruth Fremson, by the way, the photographer who took the photograph.
Yeah, and I still get the paper delivered every morning, so I have the actual paper. But I want to begin, Andrea, with you on how you found this story. Did you set out to do a story about what life was like for homeless children in New York, or did you first find her and decide that it was worth doing this deep dive?
It began in a somewhat interesting way for me. Usually I'm out on the street as a reporter and I find people and then I find a way to tell their stories. But actually here I was on maternity leave actually, and I'm sorry, I'm going to start over. Thank you. Is that better? Okay. I was on maternity leave, and I decided to read a book that I had read once before from the 80s, Alex Kotlowitz' There Are No Children Here, about 2 brothers in Chicago growing up in the projects. And what haunted me about this book was the question of, how much has changed? And here we are now. And so I was on the internet, and I was surfing, and I saw a statistic I couldn't believe, which is that 1 in 5 American children live in poverty. That's 1/5 of our future adult population. If you count the near poor, it's 1/3. It's the highest child poverty rate of any superpower and almost every developed nation. And that was astounding to me. And so that was sort of the launching point for me. And the focus on children was very deliberate, because the more I began reading about poverty, the more I saw that the issue is very easily politicized, obviously. So the focus, and this was very much Bloomberg's the administration's response to the series goes to this, really is on the adult population and goes to issues of personal responsibility. But the fact remains that we have this population of more than 16 million children in this country who are growing up in really adverse conditions that mean higher rates of incarceration, higher rates of drug use, and the stakes are really high. And so that's kind of what launched me, and I needed to bring this bottle of water up with me because it's so symbolic. I was standing in front of a shelter. The second aha moment was then I said, okay, I've got kids, I've got to do this in New York City. So what's the story in New York? Found that there were more than 20,000 children in the shelter system, the highest number since the Great Depression. That seemed pretty scandalous. I went to a shelter and I was standing outside after talking to Josh Goldfein at Legal Aid, who's here with us. And Auburn seemed like a good shelter to try. It was off limits, which made me want to get inside more, completely off limits to the public. And I was standing outside, and this procession of children came walking out with this freckle-faced mom at the front. And it was a little bit like a Maria von Trapp moment where they were like in military formation right behind her, very structured, Chanel with her kids. And Chanel
is the mother,
who is named after the perfume, very aspirationally, named her daughter after the bottled water that had just come to Brooklyn with this new wave of gentrifiers in 2001. And they were now living in a shelter in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, that had been utterly transformed, and it's where Faith teaches. And there are several housing projects right around the shelter. And just to give you a snapshot of that, the top quintile of people living in this census tract where Dasani was living in this squalid shelter earn 76 times what the bottom 5% earn in this little area. So you've got people living in $2 million brownstones, and you have Dasani. And so that was immediately one of the things I wanted to try to understand is Chanel's experience growing up in poverty. Her mother was one of isolation, one of being completely separate, never exposed to anything other than intergenerational poverty. Dasani is growing up, like many kids today in New York City, in this extremely wealthy city where there's a huge gap, but exposed to everything that's out of reach.
And you talk about how her story really shows how New York has changed, something that we just heard Commissioner Bratton talking about. The New York that we experience now is so different than the New York of 10 years ago. And in her lifetime, she's living now in a city where all kinds of things have happened to create this sort of wonderful, almost playground of a city that you see, but that she sees, she experiences. Ironically, when she rides the subway, she's wearing cast-off clothes that make her look almost affluent, because she's wearing cast-off Uggs and designer jackets, but yet she is living in sort of a pinhole of poverty that is getting tighter and tighter and tighter.
She's like looking through the glass into a store full of things she can't have, literally and metaphorically, right? So poverty wears itself in much more subtle ways in a place like New York City. And it's interesting because as a reporter, I had been in very, very poor places before, in the slums of northern Morocco, for instance. And there's an argument out there that, poverty, that it's this whole idea that we have this poor population of children is kind of overstated because they have flat screen TVs. When you go into the projects, you can see people have TVs. Well, and I think Faith can talk about this. I mean, really the question for me became not what do they have? I mean, yes, Dasani has used Uggs because there are a lot of wealthy people around her donating to the shelter, but the measure, shouldn't it be more, what's the gap between what she has and what she needs in order to attain the life that the rest of us have? And
when she arrived at school, she was a child who had great promise. You noted in the piece that she had sort of an intuitive understanding of academic material, but she had something else. She had almost an inner compass, a certain pride in the way she carried herself despite her circumstances.
Can I speak to this issue of poverty
Of course.
and how it impacts education? Poverty is demoralizing. It's debilitating. And to have like this, I grew up in that type of situation. I also grew up in the projects not far from Fort Greene projects where I teach. That's why I chose to teach there. And to have a visual of something that's so inaccessible. Poverty also makes you extremely angry. And there's a compensation mode. Part of why they wear those expensive clothing and designer wear, it's a compensation thing. Because you never believe that you can attain what other people have. So you kind of always try to wear, you're always trying to prove that you're good enough. But you don't ever feel that you are. And to have a visual of what you cannot obtain, I cannot tell you how painful that absolutely is, and how it must exacerbate
a different
the entire
dimension
problem.
to poverty now.
Absolutely, because I was poor growing up, but my mother made do, and so there wasn't a real sense of I'm poor. We went to church, we did things together, there was love, but I didn't have anything to compare it to. As a matter of fact, the people around me, because my mother was a seamstress, and she made some of our clothing out of like sheets, and we were the best dressed, nobody knew why. But in any event, the disparity wasn't clear at all. We were often the most wealthy, do you know? So there was no issue at all. And then I was bussed out, and so I was almost seen as a privileged kid. And my mother made sure that I didn't associate with the neighborhood children. So there was that. I was like a privileged kid. If I had a picture of where I could be, that would just have fed into the hopelessness, and that's the problem.
I want to be clear on that. It's
Yes.
not necessarily where you could be, because that could be aspirational. I
Right.
think what you're saying is a picture of what you could be, but there's a wall of invisible cement that separates you from that. That
Right.
it's there but not attainable in your
Right.
mind, and that's the dimension that.
That's the dimension, and that's the dimension that these students are dealing with, where the poverty is just exacerbating. I mean, so there's the poverty, and then because of the poverty, there's the homelessness. Then because of the homelessness and other issues, there's the addiction issues. I mean, they have all of these things that they're contending with, and then the teachers are the reason that nobody's learning. Like, seriously, your priorities are completely different when you're hungry.
Right.
I don't care if you're Einstein. If you come to school and you haven't eaten, you can't think. You can't articulate your thoughts. You can't write. It's impossible. It's not going to happen. So it's so important that we look at all of these ingredients. Then to compound that, it's perception. And so now we have to because I'm an insider, if you will, of a graduate of poverty, if you will, I have a different look at the children. I'm a hope pusher, all right, not a dope pusher. Get that right. So
Say it one more time. Go ahead, say it one more time.
HOPE pusher, okay? And so what I do is I identify gift, because these children feel powerless. And their parents feel powerless, so they're constantly, getting this message that you're nothing, you'll never be anything, we're nothing, and we just have to make do. A lot of them don't expect to live past 20 years old. 25, you're like over the hill. I'm 27, it's not that bad. But I'm just saying, sincerely.
So what's the antidote to that when they come to school with that?
Well, let me just jump in and let's bring this back to Dasani. So do you remember, Faith, one day at school we were talking about Dasani, who really was the adultified child in her household.
Yes.
So she was basically the parent.
And can you just describe that for a minute? Because you describe how her hands are always going. She's feeding somebody.
Yeah.
She's doing someone's
She's
hair.
changing a diaper with
She's-
one hand, she's getting the bottle ready with the other. This is a kid who, most kids are arriving, in the city to school in the morning, 7:30, 8 a.m., having just rolled out of bed and gotten fed breakfast by their kids. Dasani, by that time, has been up 3 hours, has gotten everyone else fed and dressed, walked one set to the middle school, come back, usually comes hungry because she's missed free breakfast, because there is free breakfast, but she missed it every time, and would get hungry to distraction in school. And she was mom, basically. So, but without the tools. And so she would put Hawaiian punch in the bottle and things, because what else would you do? It looked good, and the baby liked it, and Lily has 4 rotting teeth as a result. So we were talking one day, and I'll just never forget, and it was one of so many revelatory moments with Faith, where we were just talking through these issues, and I said, what do you think's going to happen to Dasani? And you said, I don't know if you remember, you said, what I really hope is she doesn't go off and have her own baby so she can stop taking care of these ones, because that's what I see over and over again.
I certainly do.
It was a very different understanding of teenage pregnancy than I had up until then. That's what your view or your understanding of this is that they're kind of escaping these other responsibilities by just having their own responsibility that's
Sure.
concentrated in one child.
Well, it's all about distraction. And just, you said that she became the parent without having any tools. The parent doesn't have any tools. everything in this arena, everything in this life is about survival, okay? So your agenda is entirely different. You know, we heard about parental responsibility. Once a parent who is poverty-stricken drops their child off to school, they think they have met their parental responsibility. They don't think that there needs to be any further engagement. They don't have the capacity to engage, not because they don't love their children, because they're bogged. How am I going to feed them? Okay, they have 2 meals in school. Make sure you eat. I know you're ashamed to eat the free food because they are called free, but make sure you eat because we don't have this much left. They've overcompensated with these clothes that they really can't afford, but they have to look the part and fit in and make themselves grander than they actually feel. So there are all these dynamics going on, and you know, the parents just really think that they are doing their responsibility. This last situation really got my attention.
Which last situation?
With the teachers in Georgia who cheated.
Oh.
Standardized testing, any testing does not test children. It tests their parents. That's who they're testing. They test their parents' involvement. They
So they're
test
testing
their
child
parents'
preparedness.
money. Because if you can get your child tutoring, if you can get your child instruction in an instrument which raises their aptitude, you're going to have a different child with the same intelligence, maybe with less intelligence.
So I want to bring this back to Dasani, and I know that even though her story was made public, there are privacy concerns because she was sort of thrust in the spotlight in a significant way, and you have been very careful to protect her and protect her family from that. But to the extent that you can talk about it, tell us how she's doing today.
She's continuing to struggle. She's doing better. So the impact of the series, none of us really quite saw it coming. I don't know, it was very hard for her to, it would be hard for anyone in this audience to be on the front page of the New York Times, their face, their likeness, for 5 days in a row. If you are a member of, if you're living in a low-income neighborhood like she always was, at the time it ran, she was already in Harlem, you know where you go for the New York Times. You go to the closest Starbucks, because that's where you can look at it. So they'd go every morning to see, they'd already read it online, but it was, it's more than any 11-year-old can take, and I think it was extremely exciting and very seductive, like it would be for anybody to be an immediate celebrity. People were walking up to the family in the subway. They still are, actually.
And the mother she's heavily freckled.
She cannot hide.
So you can spot her
recognized.
when you see her. But how was it for Dasani? I mean, the thing that I wondered about was the schoolyard.
So
Yeah.
you can talk about this.
I can. One of the biggest things that the students who live in shelters try to do is hide the fact that they're living in a shelter. So to have that to be, that is their whole quest. They come to school late for different reasons, but a lot of the times they think that everybody knows where they reside, and that is their quest, to make sure nobody knows where they reside.
And they were
so
calling her,
the moment
shelter.
that was revealed was horrifying. But at the same time, there were good things that came as a result of that story, to the school and things of that nature. But for her, it was an absolute mixed bag. It was a mixed bag.
It was.
And her journey continues. It still.
It does.
It's still.
Yes.
One of the things that came out of this is this conversation. We're talking about poverty, but much as in the conversation that I just had with Ta-Nehisi, I wonder if words count here. Someone once told me, if you're going to talk about poverty, try having that conversation without using the word poverty.
Right.
So then you have to say what it really is.
Hopelessness.
Hunger, need. So
Yes.
every time you try to talk about poverty, you can't use that word, and you have to describe a situation instead of sort of an easy term. If we're trying to think about poverty, that's just one example. How do we need to think about framing that conversation, making sure that we're still having that conversation? We're tiptoeing up to a presidential campaign, and there's a lot of talk about income inequality, and there's a lot of talk around it, but not necessarily about young children like Dasani who live in homeless shelters in New York, children who live in rural or exurban poverty, where poverty rates are also skyrocketing. what is one easy, and there's never an easy thing, but one thing that maybe people
the
can put
word
their
that just
hands
came
around?
immediately to me was access. I feel like this is an experience, and it varies from town to town, place to place, and there's a huge white poor population, a huge Asian poor population in the city, but what you see cutting across all of these ethnic and racial differences is an lack of access, really, to the opportunities that are needed in order to get ahead. And I think that there's so many ways. I don't know. I was saying to you earlier. I mean, I kind of look at poverty as it's almost like talking about the air. I mean, it just touches every part of a person's life. There's no way to really. There's no magic bullet. There's just because it's not a subject that lends itself to one easy classification or definition. It requires a multi-pronged effort. It goes to education, it goes to housing, it goes to incarceration, it goes to racial and social justice. All of these things are structural, and there's also a huge piece of it that's parenting. But I think ultimately, the goal has to be one of access, of creating greater access, of creating access, period. To all of these opportunities that everyone else seems to take for granted.
And can I piggyback off of that just to say that to keep the conversation going, because I use this illustration. You get on the train and there's somebody that has a horrific odor, but if you stay on the train, eventually that odor will go away and you'll forget about it. And that's what you're saying about poverty. Know that there's no remedy. Someone told me that men want to fix everybody and women want to help everybody. And so you don't want to enter into these conversations because you want an answer, a quick answer. And if you don't feel like there's an answer straight away, you don't want to participate. Don't be afraid of the conversation. Don't be afraid of the mess. Don't be afraid of the mud. Don't be afraid of it. And just, embrace it, explore it, discuss it, invite others to talk about their own personal experience, and know that there is a remedy that exists, but it's not, we're certainly not going to reach it if we don't confront it.
Faith Hester, thank you for your work in the classroom and for being here today. Andrea,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we should say you're working on a book about this, and we look forward to that.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right.